"Put me down," Tyler Hayes rasped, his voice raw from exhaustion as the sinking sun painted the California sky in shades of amber. "After everything I said, just leave me here." Nia Brooks never answered. She adjusted her grip, shifted his weight higher across her shoulders with practiced precision, and took another slow step through the loose sand. Every foot sank several inches before she forced herself forward again, steady, balanced, never wasting movement. Sweat traced quiet lines across the dust on her face, but her breathing remained measured, almost calm, as though carrying a full-grown man across the final stretch of the course was simply another task to complete. Behind them, 3 separate medical teams were treating the other recruits she had already carried to safety one by one. Ahead, the finish marker stood less than 300 yards away, surrounded by instructors who had stopped talking several minutes earlier. No one cheered. No one shouted encouragement. They simply watched the quiet black woman continue walking beneath a burden everyone believed should have broken her hours ago. Tyler lowered his head against her shoulder, ashamed to meet anyone's eyes. That morning he had laughed louder than anyone else. He had joked that she would be lucky just to keep up. He had called her dead weight before the first whistle ever blew. Now the only reason he was still moving toward the finish line was because the same woman he had mocked refused to leave him behind. "Why?" he whispered so quietly only she could hear. "You don't owe me anything." Nia kept her eyes on the distant marker as another slow step pressed deep into the sand. "This stopped being about you a long time ago," she said. The wind carried her words away almost as soon as they were spoken. Tyler closed his eyes, remembering the laughter that had echoed across the beach only hours earlier, laughter that now seemed to belong to someone else entirely. The instructors standing near the finish exchanged silent glances. They all knew something Tyler did not. They knew exactly who Nia Brooks was. They knew why every movement looked effortless despite the weight on her shoulders. They knew why Senior Chief Daniel Mercer had never interrupted the day's events, even when every instinct told him to step in. Mercer folded his arms and kept watching without saying a word. He had spent more than 20 years training sailors, Marines, and special operations candidates. He had watched exceptional athletes fail because of pride and ordinary-looking men and women succeed because they refused to quit when everyone else did. But today was never designed to measure raw strength. Today measured something far more difficult to teach. Tyler swallowed hard. "I was wrong," he finally admitted. Nia said nothing. The silence somehow carried more weight than any lecture ever could. Less than 100 yards remained. Every instructor stood motionless. Even the recruits who had already finished turned toward the lonely pair crossing the final stretch together. Hours earlier, those same spectators had smiled at careless jokes. Now nobody seemed willing to speak above a whisper. Tyler realized something else that hurt even more than the burning muscles throughout his body. She had gone back for him. After carrying Connor to the first aid station. After helping Mason through a twisted ankle. After supporting Luke across the final ridge. She had returned for the one person who deserved it the least. His fingers tightened against the back of her training shirt. "You should have left me." Nia finally looked toward the horizon where the sun rested just above the Pacific Ocean. "No one gets left behind," she replied quietly. Those 5 words settled over the beach with more force than any shouted command. The finish line grew closer with every deliberate step until the scene itself began to fade beneath the memory of how the day had truly started. Only 12 hours earlier, before the heat, before the exhaustion, before humility replaced arrogance, the morning air had been cool enough for every breath to rise in faint clouds over Coronado Beach. Fresh recruits gathered beside enormous weathered training logs while gulls circled overhead and waves rolled steadily onto the shore. Boots crunched across damp sand as instructors prepared clipboards and stopwatches. Tyler Hayes stood laughing with Connor Reed and Mason Cole while Luke Bennett listened nearby. Then they noticed the woman assigned to stand beside their log. She wasn't particularly tall. She wasn't built like the professional athletes Tyler admired. Her uniform carried no visible decorations beyond standard markings, and nothing about her calm expression suggested she belonged anywhere near one of the toughest endurance events on the schedule. Tyler glanced at his friends, smirked, and said just loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear, "Guess we're carrying extra weight before we even pick up the log." Several recruits laughed immediately. Connor shook his head with a grin. Mason looked Nia up and down without trying to hide his skepticism. Luke forced an uncomfortable smile because everyone else did. Nia quietly tightened the straps on her gloves, rested one hand against the rough wood, and studied the long stretch of beach disappearing toward the distant dunes. Only then did she lift her eyes toward Tyler with a calm expression that revealed absolutely nothing. "Save your breath," she said evenly. "You're going to need every bit of it before this day is over." The whistle had not blown yet, but the beach already carried the quiet tension that existed before every difficult evolution. A cool breeze rolled in from the Pacific, carrying the smell of salt water across Coronado Beach as instructors moved through the formation with clipboards in hand. Massive training logs rested on the sand, dark from the morning moisture, each one waiting for a team that believed determination alone could conquer weight. Senior Chief Daniel Mercer walked slowly between the groups without raising his voice. He had no interest in speeches. Experience had taught him that people usually revealed themselves long before the first mile. Tyler Hayes stretched his shoulders with exaggerated confidence, while Connor Reed bounced lightly on his feet, eager to prove he belonged among the strongest recruits in the class. Mason Cole adjusted his gloves and grinned. Years of college football had convinced him that physical strength solved nearly every problem worth solving. Luke Bennett remained quieter than the others, studying the course markers disappearing into the dunes. Then Nia Brooks stepped into position beside them. She wore the same plain physical training uniform as everyone else. No special insignia decorated her chest. No ribbons hinted at previous accomplishments. Her dark hair was secured neatly beneath a simple cap, and she carried herself with the relaxed posture of someone who had nothing to prove. Tyler looked at her for several seconds before shaking his head with a laugh. "There has to be some mistake," he said. "She is supposed to help evaluate us, not slow our team down." Connor chuckled. "Maybe they wanted to give the rest of the class a head start." Mason crossed his arms. "Either that, or they are testing whether we can carry more than just the log." A few nearby recruits overheard the remarks and smiled quietly. Luke looked toward Nia, expecting some kind of response, but she simply crouched beside the log and ran one gloved hand across the weathered wood. Her fingers paused near a narrow crack that most people would never have noticed. She traced it for only a moment before standing again. Tyler frowned. "What are you doing?" Nia answered without looking up. "Checking the balance points." Mason laughed louder. "It is a log, not a spacecraft." Nia nodded once. "Everything has balance." Connor rolled his eyes. "You really think that matters?" She met his gaze calmly. "It matters if you plan on carrying it for several miles." Before Connor could answer, Mercer approached the group. His expression remained unreadable as he stopped beside the log. "Positions," he ordered. Everyone immediately stepped into place. Tyler claimed the front left position without hesitation. Connor moved beside him. Mason took the rear left. Luke settled into the rear right. That left the center support position for Nia, the spot that absorbed changing pressure whenever the team lost rhythm. Tyler noticed where she stood and smirked. "Hope you can keep up." Nia adjusted her grip. "Stay together, and the log feels lighter." Tyler answered with a confident smile. "We do not need advice." Mercer watched the exchange without interrupting. He had heard nearly identical conversations dozens of times over the years. Different names, different faces, the same assumptions. One instructor standing nearby quietly leaned toward Mercer. "You are really letting this play out?" Mercer never took his eyes off the formation. Everyone deserves the chance to introduce themselves. The instructor glanced toward Nia. Even her. Mercer allowed the smallest hint of a smile. Especially her. Across the beach, another whistle echoed as teams completed their final equipment checks. Nia looked down the course, stretching across packed sand before climbing through rolling dunes toward distant checkpoint flags. She estimated the wind direction almost instinctively. She noticed where soft sand would steal momentum. She observed where the tide had hardened the shoreline enough to support heavier loads. None of the recruits beside her appeared to notice those details. Tyler continued talking instead. "How long do you think before she asks for a break?" Connor answered immediately. "Half a mile." Mason shook his head. "Quarter mile." Luke hesitated before quietly saying, "Maybe we should wait and see." Tyler laughed. "You are giving her way too much credit." Nia remained silent. She tightened the wrist strap on her glove one final time, planted both boots firmly beneath the log, and inhaled slowly through her nose before releasing the breath in a measured rhythm that barely moved her shoulders. Mercer raised one hand toward the formation. Every conversation along the beach stopped. The recruits bent their knees beneath the weight. The morning had barely begun, but somewhere beyond the dunes the first real lesson of the day was already waiting for them. Mercer's hand dropped through the cool morning air, and the sharp blast of the whistle rolled across the beach. Every team drove upward together as dozens of heavy logs rose from the sand in one synchronized motion. Tyler immediately shouted, "Move, move, move," and surged forward before anyone else could establish a steady rhythm. Connor and Mason matched his pace without hesitation, eager to prove they were the strongest team on the course. Luke struggled to stay perfectly aligned as the uneven weight shifted from shoulder to shoulder with every stride. Nia settled beneath the center of the log without a single wasted movement. Her boots found the firmest patches of sand almost instinctively, and each breath followed the same quiet cadence. Inhale, 2 steps. Exhale, 2 more. She never tried to overpower the weight. She simply allowed her body to work with it. Tyler glanced sideways with a confident grin. "See? We are dragging her already." Connor laughed between breaths. "We should get bonus points for carrying 2 loads." Mason added, "Maybe she should thank us after this is over." Luke looked toward Nia again, expecting irritation or frustration, but she only kept her eyes on the stretch of shoreline ahead. The early morning tide had left a narrow band of packed sand closer to the water where footing was more reliable. Instead of moving toward it, Tyler insisted on staying higher up the beach where the sand was softer because another team had already claimed the lower route. "We are faster than they are," he called. "We do not need their path." Nia spoke for the first time since the whistle. "The lower line saves energy." Tyler shook his head without even looking at her. "I did not ask." She nodded once. "You will." Connor smirked, confident for someone getting a free ride. The pace continued to increase. Several teams behind them slowly disappeared from Tyler's view, and his confidence grew with every passing minute. He interpreted the early lead as proof that his instincts were right. What he failed to notice was how Connor's shoulders were beginning to rise with each breath. Mason was tightening his grip harder every 100 yards. Luke had already started adjusting his footing more frequently to compensate for the uneven load. Nia noticed every detail without saying another word. Her attention moved quietly from one teammate to the next, measuring breathing patterns, posture, hand position, and stride length. She had seen the same sequence countless times before. Strong beginnings often created difficult endings. Ahead, the first rolling dunes came into view. The sand shifted constantly beneath every step, demanding patience instead of speed. Tyler pointed toward the slope. "We push harder here. We make everyone else chase us." Connor answered with a determined shout, and the team accelerated again. The heavier pace immediately changed the way the log moved. Small imbalances became larger ones. Every rushed stride transferred unnecessary weight from one shoulder to another. Luke stumbled briefly before catching himself. Mason corrected the tilt with raw strength, but the correction pushed extra pressure toward Connor. Nia absorbed the change almost effortlessly, preventing the log from swinging farther off balance. Tyler barely noticed. His attention remained fixed on the teams behind them. "Still think the lower path mattered?" he asked with a smile. Nia looked toward the long series of dunes stretching into the distance. "The course has only started." Tyler laughed. "Sounds like someone is already making excuses." Connor joined the laughter, but the sound ended with a deeper breath than before. Mason flexed his fingers without realizing he had started losing feeling in them from gripping too tightly. Luke wiped sweat from his forehead even though the morning sun had barely climbed above the horizon. Mercer observed everything from an all-terrain vehicle traveling along the edge of the course. One younger instructor looked at the stopwatch and nodded with approval. "Fastest split so far." Mercer continued watching Nia instead of the clock. "Fast is easy," he replied quietly. "Consistent is difficult." The instructor frowned. "They look strong." Mercer answered, "Right now they are competing against the other teams. Before this day ends, they will be competing against themselves." Nearly a mile into the course, the beach narrowed where the incoming tide had carved a shallow channel through the sand. Tyler chose the shortest route without slowing down. The uneven ground forced the log to dip unexpectedly toward Luke's side. Luke recovered before losing his footing completely, but his shoulder slipped just enough for the weight to shift sharply across the formation. Connor tightened his grip to compensate. Mason leaned harder into the load. Tyler shouted for everyone to keep moving. Only Nia remained perfectly balanced beneath the changing pressure, her breathing never changing, her expression never revealing concern. She looked once toward Connor's hands and noticed the strap around his right wrist had twisted under the handle. It was a small mistake now, almost invisible beneath the motion, but every additional yard would tighten it a little more. She spoke calmly without raising her voice. "Connor, fix your wrist strap before the next climb." He barely glanced toward her. "I am fine. You will not be if you wait." Tyler answered before Connor could say anything else. "Nobody stops. Keep moving." Nia looked ahead toward the steepest dune on the entire course, then back toward the twisted strap, slowly tightening around Connor's wrist. She said nothing more, but for the first time that morning, she knew the hardest part of the day would not come from the weight of the log. It would come from the weight of pride. The first major dune rose ahead like a wall of pale sand, its slopes scattered with deep footprints left by the teams that had crossed only minutes earlier. Every step became heavier as the loose ground slipped backward beneath their boots. Tyler leaned forward and shouted, "Push through it. Do not slow down now." Connor answered with a strained breath and forced himself to match the pace. Mason lowered his shoulder harder beneath the log, determined to keep their lead. Luke focused on placing each foot carefully, but the shifting sand demanded more balance than strength. Nia continued moving with the same steady rhythm she had maintained since the whistle. Nothing about her breathing changed. Nothing about her posture suggested fatigue. She simply shortened her stride slightly and allowed each movement to follow the natural slope instead of fighting against it. The difference was subtle enough that only someone with years of experience would have noticed it. Tyler did not. He believed effort alone solved every obstacle. "Come on," he called over his shoulder. "This hill is nothing." Nia spoke without raising her voice. "It is not the hill. It is everything that comes after it." Tyler shook his head. "You worry too much." Connor laughed weakly, but the laugh faded into another long breath. The twisted wrist strap had begun pressing more firmly against his right hand. Every shift of the log tightened it another fraction. He flexed his fingers once, trying to ignore the tingling sensation spreading toward his palm. Mason noticed the movement. "You good?" Connor answered immediately. "Perfect." Nia heard both of them. "Fix the strap at the top." Tyler interrupted before Connor could respond. "Nobody stops until the checkpoint." Nia looked toward the crest of the dune. "You will lose less time fixing it now than carrying the mistake later." Tyler smiled without turning around. "I am the one setting the pace." She simply answered, "For now." They reached the top with the morning sun shining fully across the beach. The ocean stretched endlessly to their left while the training course curved inland through another series of rolling dunes. Other teams had started spreading apart as the stronger runners naturally separated from those who had opened too aggressively. Tyler glanced behind them with satisfaction. Several groups were now hundreds of yards back. "See that?" he said proudly. "We are pulling away." Mason grinned. "Told you speed wins." Luke remained quiet. He noticed something different. The teams farther behind were moving slower, but their formations remained smooth and synchronized. Nobody looked rushed. Nobody appeared to be arguing. Their own team, despite leading the course, was no longer carrying the log evenly. Small corrections happened every few steps. Connor shook his right hand once while pretending to adjust his grip. Mason rolled his shoulders repeatedly. Tyler breathed louder than before, although he refused to acknowledge it. Only Nia looked exactly as she had at the starting line. Mercer continued following from a distance in the support vehicle. Another instructor studied the front team through binoculars. "They are still leading." Mercer nodded. "Yes. Do you think they hold it?" Mercer watched Nia rather than the stopwatch. "That depends on whether they learn before the course teaches them." The instructor looked puzzled by the answer. Mercer offered nothing more. The next section crossed softer sand where every step sank nearly ankle deep. Tyler ordered another increase in speed anyway. Connor obeyed, but his right hand had begun feeling strangely stiff. The twisted strap now pressed tightly enough that his grip changed without him realizing it. Nia noticed immediately. "Connor." He looked toward her. Switch your grip. Tyler answered instead. He said he is fine. Connor nodded, even though he no longer trusted the feeling in his hand. Mason laughed. Maybe she just wants an excuse to rest. Nia did not react. She simply shifted a little more weight onto her own shoulder to keep the log balanced. Luke quietly watched her. Every time someone lost rhythm, she compensated before the rest of the team even noticed. She never complained about the extra load. She never reminded anyone she had warned them twice already. She simply kept moving. Another quarter-mile passed before Connor finally opened and closed his right hand again. This time his fingers responded more slowly. His smile disappeared for just a second. Nia saw it immediately. How many fingers can you feel? Connor frowned. What? How many? Tyler looked back with annoyance. Can we stop talking and keep moving? Nia answered calmly. We are talking because I want all 5 of us to finish. Tyler laughed. You worry about finishing. I worry about winning. Nia looked ahead toward the endless line of dunes shimmering beneath the strengthening sun. Those are not always the same thing. Connor said nothing. He flexed his hand one more time and quietly hoped the numbness would disappear on its own. It did not. Instead, as they approached the next steep climb, the first signs of real trouble had already begun, and none of them, except Nia, understood how quickly a small mistake could grow into the moment that changed the entire day. The sun climbed higher, and the cool air that had greeted the recruits at sunrise disappeared beneath growing heat rising from the sand. Every step demanded more effort than the last. Sweat soaked through uniforms, gloves grew slick, and breathing became louder across every team scattered along the course. Tyler refused to acknowledge any of it. He glanced at another squad closing the distance behind them and immediately increased the pace again. Nobody passes us, he called. Connor answered with determination, but his right hand no longer felt completely connected to the handle beneath the log. The twisted strap had tightened until 2 of his fingers responded only with a dull tingling sensation. He secretly tried opening and closing his hand between steps, hoping the feeling would return before anyone noticed. It did not. Mason lowered his shoulder farther beneath the log to compensate for Connor's weakening grip. Luke stayed focused on matching the team's rhythm, but the constant adjustments were becoming harder to predict. Only Nia remained remarkably steady, quietly absorbing each uneven shift before it spread through the formation. She watched Connor's wrist for another minute before speaking again. Connor, stop for 10 seconds. Tyler answered instantly. We are not stopping. Nia never looked away from Connor. You are losing circulation. Connor forced a smile. I am still carrying it. For now, Nia replied calmly. Tyler laughed without slowing down. You really do love telling people what they cannot do. Nia answered with the same even tone she had used all morning. I tell people what I see. Another rise appeared ahead, steeper than the last, and covered with deep loose sand that shifted beneath every boot. Tyler attacked the climb with raw effort. Connor followed, determined not to appear weak. Mason leaned harder into the load. Luke struggled to keep perfect alignment as the log began rocking more noticeably from side to side. Halfway up the slope, Connor's right hand suddenly failed to close completely around the handle. His grip slipped just enough for the weight to shift unexpectedly toward Luke. The heavy log tilted sharply across the formation. Luke instinctively stepped sideways to recover his balance, but the soft sand gave way beneath his boot. Before the movement could throw the entire team out of position, Nia rotated smoothly beneath the center support, lifted her shoulder into the changing load, and stabilized the log before it could swing any farther. The correction happened so naturally that several nearby recruits barely understood what they had witnessed. Tyler stumbled one step before regaining his footing. Mason blinked in surprise. Luke stared at Nia with wide eyes. Connor finally released the handle and shook his numb hand in frustration. The entire team came to a stop for the first time that morning. Tyler turned immediately. Why did everyone stop? Nia looked directly at Connor's wrist. Because he cannot safely hold the weight anymore. Connor slowly pulled free the twisted strap. The skin beneath it had turned pale where the pressure had been building for miles. He flexed his fingers again, but they moved stiffly. Nia gently loosened the strap, adjusted its position, and guided him through a few simple movements to restore circulation. She never criticized him. She never reminded anyone that she had warned them repeatedly. She simply fixed the problem as efficiently as she had identified it. Connor looked at her with genuine confusion. How did you know? Nia tightened the strap correctly before answering. Your shoulder changed before your hand did. Your breathing changed before your shoulder did. Your grip changed before either of them. Connor looked down at his own hand, realizing he had never noticed any of those details himself. Mason stared silently. Luke watched every movement with growing respect. Tyler folded his arms. Can we go now? Nia stood and nodded. Yes, but we changed positions. Tyler shook his head. I am staying in front. I know, Nia replied. Connor moves beside me. Tyler frowned. Why? Because I can take more of the load while his hand recovers. Tyler hesitated for only a second before giving a dismissive shrug. Fine. Whatever gets us moving. They lifted the log once more. This time Connor immediately noticed something different. The weight felt lighter, not because the log had changed, but because Nia had quietly redistributed the pressure across the formation without making a show of it. She shortened her stride slightly, adjusted the angle beneath her shoulder, and somehow the entire team moved more smoothly than they had all morning. Even Tyler felt the difference, although pride refused to let him admit it aloud. Behind them, Mercer watched through binoculars as the formation settled into a steadier rhythm. The younger instructor beside him finally spoke. She fixed the team in less than a minute. Mercer nodded quietly. No, she gave them the opportunity to fix themselves. Far ahead, the course curved inland once more toward a long stretch of deep sand shimmering beneath the late morning sun. Tyler looked at the distant checkpoint and smiled confidently, believing the hardest part of the day was finally behind them. Nia looked at the same horizon and silently knew the real test had not even begun. By early afternoon, the temperature had climbed into the upper 80s, and the bright California sun reflected off the pale sand until the entire course shimmered in waves of heat. Every team looked different now than it had at sunrise. The loud conversations had faded into measured breathing. The easy confidence that filled the starting line had been replaced by quiet concentration. Tyler Hayes still refused to surrender the lead position, but the energy that had fueled his confidence hours earlier was disappearing one step at a time. His shoulders rose with every breath, and he drank more frequently from his canteen without saying a word. Connor's hand had gradually recovered after Nia corrected the twisted strap, but he remained unusually quiet, replaying her earlier warning in his mind. Mason no longer joked between checkpoints. His powerful legs still pushed the team forward, yet every climb demanded noticeably more effort than the last. Luke had begun watching Nia instead of Tyler. He noticed how she never fought the log. She anticipated it. Whenever the uneven terrain shifted the weight unexpectedly, she adjusted before anyone else even realized a correction was needed. It almost looked effortless, but Luke understood that nothing about this day was easy. They reached a hydration station where instructors allowed each team a brief pause before the next section of the course. Several recruits immediately collapsed onto one knee while drinking water. Tyler remained standing. 30 seconds, he said. That is all we need. Nia unscrewed her canteen and drank slowly instead of quickly. Drink before you are thirsty, she said calmly. If you wait until then, you are already behind. Tyler wiped sweat from his forehead. We are still in front. Nia looked toward the long stretch of dunes waiting beyond the checkpoint. Being first halfway through does not count for much if you cannot finish together. Mason took another drink before asking, how do you stay so calm? Nia smiled faintly without answering the question directly. One step is never difficult. People get into trouble when they start worrying about the next 1,000. Connor studied her for a moment. You have done this before. She replaced the cap on her canteen. I have carried heavy things before. Tyler laughed quietly. You always answer everything except the actual question. Nia shrugged. Sometimes the answer matters less than what you do next. Mercer signaled that the break had ended. Every team lifted their logs once again and continued inland where the beach narrowed into a series of winding trails covered with loose sand and low scrub. The change in terrain forced every formation to become more precise. Tyler attempted to maintain the aggressive pace that had carried them into the lead, but the narrow trail punished every rushed movement. Mason slipped once before catching himself. Connor adjusted his footing twice within a few yards. Luke brushed a branch with his shoulder as the trail curved unexpectedly. Nia quietly shifted her position each time, smoothing out the team's movement without drawing attention to herself. Tyler finally spoke between heavier breaths. Why do you keep changing your steps? Because the ground keeps changing, Nia replied. You cannot use the same rhythm everywhere. Tyler frowned. Rhythm is rhythm. Not on sand. Not on hills. Not when people get tired. Connor glanced toward Tyler before asking Nia another question. How do you know when someone is about to struggle? She answered while keeping her eyes on the trail ahead. People usually tell you before they realize they are speaking. Connor looked confused. How? Breathing. Posture. Shoulders. The way they stop looking ahead and start looking at the ground. Mason slowly lifted his head after hearing those words. He realized he had been staring at the trail for nearly 10 minutes. Luke noticed the same thing about himself. Tyler remained silent. The afternoon wore on as the heat continued building. Teams that had started too quickly now appeared farther apart across the course. Some walked steadily. Others paused more often. The early competition had faded into a simple determination to reach the finish line before sunset. Nia observed the changing landscape with the same calm attention she had shown since dawn. She noticed the shadows growing slightly longer. She measured the distance between checkpoints without needing markers. She calculated the remaining effort in quiet silence. Connor finally asked the question that had been growing in his mind all day. Where did you learn all this? Nia took another measured step before answering. From people who understood that bringing everyone home mattered more than being the fastest person on the beach. The words settled over the team more heavily than the log itself. Even Tyler did not interrupt this time. For the first time that day, the 4 recruits began matching Nia's rhythm instead of fighting it. Their pace became steadier. Their breathing slowly synchronized. The log rode more evenly across their shoulders than it had since the opening whistle. Mercer watched the change from a distant ridge and nodded almost imperceptibly. The lesson was finally beginning to reach them. Yet as the afternoon shadows stretched farther across the dunes, another challenge waited beyond the next rise, one that no amount of strength alone would solve. The next checkpoint appeared just beyond a long ridge where the afternoon wind swept fresh sand across the trail, erasing footprints almost as quickly as they were made. The instructors standing there watched every team carefully, but offered no encouragement beyond short reminders to stay hydrated and maintain proper form. Tyler accepted another canteen refill and immediately looked toward the remaining course. The finish still seemed impossibly far away, hidden behind another series of dunes stretching toward the distant shoreline. We keep moving, he said, trying to sound as confident as he had that morning. His voice no longer carried the same certainty. Connor nodded, although his shoulders sagged with exhaustion. Mason rolled one arm to loosen the growing stiffness in his muscles. Luke quietly adjusted his gloves before looking toward Nia. She appeared almost unchanged despite the miles already behind them. Fine grains of sand covered her boots and sleeves, but her breathing remained controlled, her posture steady, and her attention fixed on the people around her instead of herself. As they lifted the log once more, Nia spoke softly. Stay together through this section. The soft sand ahead takes more energy than it looks. This time no one laughed. Tyler hesitated for a brief moment before answering. All right, we stay together. It was the first time all day he had accepted one of her suggestions without an argument. They moved into the deepest stretch of sand on the course where every step seemed to disappear beneath their weight. The pace naturally slowed. The log settled more evenly across 5 shoulders as each recruit unconsciously matched Nia's rhythm. For nearly half a mile the team moved in complete silence except for steady breathing and the distant sound of waves rolling onto the beach. Then Connor's pace suddenly faltered. He tried to hide it by shortening his stride, but Nia noticed immediately. Connor, he answered without looking up. I am all right. She watched him for another few seconds. You are overheating. Tyler looked back. Can you make it? Connor forced a weak smile. Of course. 3 more minutes passed before his steps became uneven again. This time he slowed enough for the log to tilt noticeably. Tyler instinctively tried to compensate with brute strength, but Nia gently steadied the load before it shifted farther. Set it down, she said calmly. Nobody argued. They lowered the log together. Connor sat in the sand, breathing heavily while removing his gloves. Nia handed him her own canteen before he even asked. Small drinks, she said. Not all at once. Connor followed her instructions without hesitation. Tyler watched quietly, remembering how many times he had ignored those same calm warnings earlier in the day. After several minutes, Connor stood again, but his legs remained unsteady. He looked embarrassed more than anything else. I slowed everybody down. Nia shook her head. No, you recognized it before it became worse. Connor looked surprised. That counts. They lifted the log again and continued, but less than a mile later, Mason began favoring one leg after stepping awkwardly into a patch of loose sand hidden beneath dry grass. He insisted he could continue, yet every few steps became shorter than the last. Nia moved slightly closer to his side beneath the log, quietly accepting more of the weight without making him feel singled out. Luke noticed the adjustment immediately. You are carrying more than anyone else, he said. Nia answered with a faint smile. Today someone always has to. Tyler looked toward her for several seconds before lowering his eyes. There was no sarcasm left in his expression, only growing respect mixed with regret. The afternoon shadows stretched longer across the dunes as the finish line slowly drew closer. Every remaining step demanded patience rather than pride. Tyler finally broke the silence. I owe you an apology. Nia kept walking. Save your energy. No, Tyler said quietly. I judged you before I knew anything about you. She did not answer immediately. The team continued forward together for another 100 yards before she finally spoke. The course is not over yet. Tyler nodded. He understood she was asking him to focus on the people beside him instead of the words behind him. Ahead, another instructor waved toward the final stretch leading back toward the beach. The finish was now within reach, but the hardest miles had changed every member of the team in ways none of them had expected. As the late afternoon sun drifted lower over the Pacific, Tyler glanced at Nia once more and realized the strongest person among them had never been the one who talked the most. She had been the one quietly carrying far more than anyone had ever noticed. The final miles stretched across the beach beneath a lowering sun, and every shadow grew longer with each step. The ocean breeze returned, cooler now, but it could not erase the exhaustion that had settled into every recruit on the course. The finish marker stood somewhere beyond the last ridge, close enough to imagine, yet still far enough to demand everything they had left. Tyler no longer cared about finishing first. Hours earlier, he would have measured success by the teams behind him. Now he looked only at the 4 people carrying the log beside him. How much farther? He asked quietly. Nia studied the shoreline, the angle of the sun, and the next series of flags. Less than 2 miles. Tyler nodded. We can make that. They continued forward together until the final ridge forced them into another steep climb. The sand was deeper than anything they had crossed all day. Every step slipped backward before finding purchase again. Connor fought to maintain his breathing. Mason leaned harder against the weight. Luke concentrated on matching Nia's rhythm exactly as she had taught them without ever calling it a lesson. Tyler tried to encourage everyone, but halfway up the slope his own legs began responding more slowly than his determination. He pushed through another dozen steps before suddenly stopping. His breathing became uneven. He bent forward, trying to recover, then attempted another step. His knees refused to cooperate. I am fine, he insisted immediately, even before anyone asked. Nia looked at him calmly. No, you are exhausted. Tyler shook his head. I can still finish. He tried lifting the log again, but the effort lasted only a few seconds before he had to lower it carefully back onto the sand. For the first time all day, the strongest voice in the group sounded uncertain. Connor stepped closer. Take a minute. Tyler looked frustrated. We have already lost enough time because of me. Nia reached for his canteen and handed it back after checking the remaining water. Small drinks. Slow breaths. Tyler accepted both without argument. He stared down at the sand for several quiet moments before speaking again. Everything you warned us about happened. Nia remained beside him. You are still here. Tyler let out a tired laugh. Because you kept us here. Mason sat briefly beside the log, rubbing tired shoulders. I thought this was all about strength. Luke looked toward Nia. It never was it? She smiled faintly. Strength starts the job. Judgment finishes it. Tyler slowly stood again and reached for the log. He managed only a few careful steps before his pace slowed dramatically once more. The distance to the finish had become a mountain in his mind. Nia quietly studied his posture, then looked toward the instructors stationed farther down the beach. Without making a dramatic announcement, she stepped beneath the log, shifted its balance toward herself, and spoke in the same calm voice they had heard all day. Set it down. Nobody questioned her. The log rested gently on the sand. Tyler looked confused as Nia turned toward him. You carried this team long enough to learn something today, she said. Now let someone carry you. Before Tyler could protest, she guided him into a secure fireman's carry with smooth, practiced movements that looked as natural as breathing. He instinctively objected. No, I can walk. You already did, Nia answered. Now save your strength. Connor stared in disbelief. Mason blinked several times as though trying to understand how someone of Nia's build could lift Tyler so effortlessly without appearing rushed. Luke simply watched in respectful silence. Nia turned toward the remaining distance and began walking with the same measured rhythm that had carried her since sunrise. Tyler rested quietly across her shoulders, no longer embarrassed by accepting help. He looked toward the horizon, where the finish marker slowly came into view, and spoke so softly that only Nia could hear. After everything I said this morning, why did you come back for me? She never slowed her pace. Because leaving people behind is not how teams are built. Tyler closed his eyes for a moment. Every careless joke he had made echoed inside his memory. Every warning she had given returned with perfect clarity. None of them had been spoken to prove she was right. Every one of them had been spoken to help the team succeed together. As they approached the final stretch, instructors, recruits, and support staff gradually turned their attention toward the quiet woman carrying the last member of her team across the sand. Conversations faded. Stopwatches were lowered. Senior Chief Daniel Mercer stepped forward from the finish area and waited until Nia reached the line before bringing his hand sharply to his brow in a crisp salute. His voice carried clearly across the beach. Chief Petty Officer Nia Brooks, outstanding work. A wave of silence settled over everyone within earshot. Tyler slowly lifted his head. Connor, Mason, and Luke looked from Mercer back to Nia with expressions of complete disbelief. Mercer lowered his salute and continued. Some of you spent this morning wondering whether she belonged here. You never realized the woman beside you has spent years teaching experienced operators how to bring every member of a team home. Today's exercise was never about finding the strongest shoulders. It was about discovering the strongest character. No one spoke. They simply stood together beneath the evening sky, finally understanding who had been walking beside them all along. The beach grew quiet after Senior Chief Daniel Mercer's words settled over the training ground. No one rushed to speak. No one laughed. The evening breeze carried only the sound of waves rolling steadily toward the shore as the recruits slowly lowered the training log onto the sand one final time. Tyler Hayes stood silently, staring at Nia Brooks with an expression completely different from the one he had worn that morning. Hours earlier, he had measured her by appearance alone. Now he understood that every calm instruction, every warning, every quiet correction had come from years of experience he had never imagined. Connor looked down at the wrist strap Nia had adjusted hours before. It had seemed like such a small detail at the time. Now he realized that one observation had allowed him to finish the course instead of becoming another recruit forced to leave early. Mason rubbed his tired shoulders and shook his head slowly. I thought strength meant carrying the most weight, he admitted. Nia brushed the remaining sand from her gloves before answering. Real strength is knowing when someone else is carrying too much. Luke smiled quietly. I think that is the first lesson we actually learned today. Mercer stepped closer, holding a clipboard beneath one arm. His expression remained serious, but there was unmistakable satisfaction in his eyes. Every class believes this course is about endurance, he said. Every class discovers it is really about responsibility. He looked directly at Tyler. Leadership is not measured by how loudly you give orders. It is measured by how many people finish because of your decisions. Tyler lowered his head. I failed that test. Mercer shook his head once. You almost failed it. There is a difference. Tyler looked up with surprise. Mercer continued. You listened before it was too late. That is how people improve. Connor stepped forward first. Chief Brooks, he said respectfully, I owe you an apology. You tried to help me before I even realized something was wrong. I ignored you because I thought I already knew everything. Mason nodded immediately. I did the same thing. Luke took one step closer. I should have spoken up when everyone else was making jokes. Staying quiet did not make me innocent. Tyler waited until the others had finished before meeting Nia's eyes. This morning I looked at you and decided what you could do before I had seen you take a single step. I was wrong about everything. I am sorry. Nia listened without interrupting. She did not rush to accept the apologies, nor did she make anyone uncomfortable by extending the moment. Instead, she looked beyond the recruits toward the beach where dozens of other teams were still crossing the finish line together beneath the orange evening sky. Tomorrow, she said quietly, none of this course will remember your names. The four recruits looked at one another without understanding. Nia continued, the sand will be smooth again. New footprints will cover today's. The only thing that stays with you is what you choose to become after today. Tyler nodded slowly. Then I want to become someone people can trust. Nia gave the smallest approving nod. Good. Start with the people standing beside you. Mercer handed Tyler the evaluation sheet. Tyler looked down, expecting failure. Instead, he found a single handwritten sentence beneath the official scoring categories. It read, potential improves when pride gives way to humility. Connor unfolded his own evaluation. Mason and Luke did the same. Each page contained different comments, yet every one ended with the same handwritten line. Bring everyone home. Tyler looked toward Mercer. Chief Brooks wrote these? Mercer smiled for the first time all day, long before any of you reached the finish line. Tyler looked back at Nia with renewed respect. She had believed they could become better people even while they were still giving her reasons not to. The realization settled more deeply than any physical exhaustion. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared beyond the Pacific Ocean, another team approached the finish carrying their log unevenly. One recruit stumbled slightly on the loose sand. Before any instructor moved, Tyler instinctively stepped forward. Connor and Mason joined him without hesitation. Luke reached the struggling team first. Together, they steadied the log just long enough for the exhausted recruits to regain their rhythm and continue across the line under their own strength. They asked for nothing in return. When they turned back toward Nia, she simply watched with quiet approval. She did not congratulate them. She did not remind them of what they had learned. She did not need to. Their actions spoke more clearly than any speech ever could. Mercer folded his clipboard and looked across the beach. That, he said softly, is the difference between finishing a course and becoming part of a team. Nia picked up her gear and started walking toward the fading horizon with the same calm confidence she had carried from the beginning of the day. Tyler watched her disappear into the evening light before quietly saying, this morning I thought she needed us to carry her. By sunset, every one of us reached the finish because she carried something far heavier than the log. She carried our chance to become better than we were. The waves rolled gently onto the shore, erasing the last footprints from the beach one by one. But the lesson remained long after the tide had washed the sand clean. Respect had never been demanded. It had been earned through patience, quiet excellence, and the simple decision that no teammate would ever be left behind.